thank you for all that you've done. And indeed, we have that testimony that you will make a way somehow. We thank you, God, for this moment of worship and the spirit of worship that's in this place. We thank you for the privilege to gather here in the house of God among the people of God. Even now, as we approach the moment of preaching, we pray now that you would speak through these lips of clay. Speak with power, with clarity, that through your word we might be challenged, might be convicted, and we might be comforted. And if there's one in the building today who does not know Jesus as Lord and Savior, we pray that this would be the day, this would be the hour that they would give their life to him. We ask these prayers now in the name of our resurrected and living Savior, Jesus the Christ. And the people of God say together, amen, and amen. Amen. How many glad to be in the house of the Lord on today? We give honor to, first of all, God our Father, to Jesus our Savior, to the Holy Spirit our comforter and our empower, and certainly to the angel, the pastor of this house, Dr. C.L. Bachus. Come on, let's praise God for him on today. We are grateful for this opportunity to stand in this pulpit round behind this sacred desk on today. As Pastor Bachus, as Daddy said, yesterday Selwyn graduated, and I hope I get at least a little bit of a pay raise, amen, since he was graduated. And I was coming to hear Daddy preach on today. Amen. I was coming to hear Daddy preach on today. Daddy says you preach it, that means you preach it. Amen. So I guess that's what we're going to try to do on today. So to all the mothers, happy Mother's Day. To my mother, happy Mother's Day. To my baby's mama, happy Mother's Day. Amen. Amen. Wilson did such a good job that I don't have to talk about Mother's Day on today. Amen. Amen. So if you will turn with us to the gospel as recorded by John. John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Fairly lengthy section of scripture beginning at verse 1. John chapter 6, beginning at verse 1. The word of God reads, After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. Jesus went up on the mountain. There he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, the feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, seeing a great multitude coming toward him. He said to Philip, Where shall we buy bread that these may eat? All right. But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? Then Jesus said, Make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world. The Lord's word is blessed. I want to talk today for a few minutes by the help of God and the Holy Spirit from this simple subject: Jesus and a little lad's lunch. Jesus and the little lad's lunch. To begin on today, we must think about the fact that this is the only miracle of Jesus that is recorded in all four of the Gospels. All four, the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, generally follow a chronological framework as it concerns the earthly ministry of Jesus. All right. But we must remember, though, that John's Gospel is more concerned with logical flow than chronological flow. So when John opens this chapter with the words, "after these things," John, it does not mean that the beginning of John chapter 6 immediately follows the close of John chapter 5. All right. As a matter of fact, there is a period of 6 months to 1 year between the end of John chapter 5 and the beginning of John chapter 6. All right. I said earlier that this is the only miracle of Jesus that's recorded in all four Gospels. All right. The Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke record the ministry of activity of Jesus between John chapter 5 and John chapter 6. The ministry of Jesus in Galilee is a thriving ministry. He is preaching, he is teaching, he is performing miracles, casting out demons, and healing all manner of diseases. All right. Both Jesus and his disciples are in full-time ministry mode. When you look at the accounts of the other Gospels and the Gospel of John, everywhere Jesus went, from place to place, from city to city, from region to region, the crowd either meets him there or they beat him there. They are there awaiting to observe and be blessed by the ministry of Jesus. And yet the opening verses of John chapter 6, the other accounts of this miracle in the other Gospels, indicate that Jesus is trying to put himself and the disciples some distance away from the clamoring crowds. That's why it says in verse 1 that he went over the Sea of Galilee, which again is also called the Sea of Tiberias. This part of the shore was remote and desolate and uninhabited. Verse 3 shows us that Jesus is seeking a period of time to separate himself and the disciples from the surge of the seeking crowd. Yes, sir. Because it says Jesus went up on the mountain with his disciples, and he takes the ancient posture of teaching. He sat down with his disciples. Once again, we're reminded in verse 2 that although Jesus tries to distance himself from the crowd, they figure out and find out where Jesus is. Yes, sir. They follow Jesus to the very spot where he has sought rest, relief, and respite. And it is there that we observe first. We observe a problematic predicament. Yes, sir. We observe a problematic predicament. A predicament is a quandary, a pickle, a dilemma, a tight spot. And among the disciples, they perceive that they are in a problematic predicament. They're in a precarious pickle, a difficult dilemma, and a torturous tight spot. I know many of us have been in a problematic predicament before. We've all faced our difficult dilemma. It's kind of like the last time your doctor or your lawyer or your professor or your supervisor or your spouse or your children, they walk up to you and they say these words: "I have some good news and I have some bad news." This is where the disciples find themselves on today. They have some good news. The good news is because of the power of Jesus' preaching and the authority of his teaching and the power of his miracles and the purity of his presence, there are crowds following Jesus from place to place. And as a result, Jesus is able to declare the gospel, change lives, to heal, to deliver, and to set free. Now that is the good news. The crowd is following him from place to place. Now as a result of the good news, we see this problematic predicament. Look again, if you will, with me at verses 4 and 5 and verse 7. It says, now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? Verse 7. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. Jesus sees the multitude, this great gathered crowd. And in Matthew and Mark's account of this miracle, it says that Jesus had compassion on them. He was concerned for and cared for this crowd. So Jesus says to his disciple, Philip, look at this crowd. This crowd that will later we will be informed that's at least 5,000 men, not including the women and the children. He says, furthermore to Philip, look at this crowd, and where shall we buy bread that they may eat? And as we just read, Philip immediately goes into panic mode. Listen, he says, now wait a minute, Jesus. All right. We didn't prepare for this. We're not ready for this. And whether he said it out loud or not, I'm sure Philip said, listen, we didn't invite them. All right. They just showed up on their own. Let them fend for themselves. Apparently he sees that Jesus is not going to change his mind. So Philip moves to his second line of reasoning. All right. Philip says to Jesus, well, I know what you want to do. You want to feed this crowd. But have you checked the budget lately? We only have about 200 denarii, about 7 or 8 months of a normal laborer's income. And with that, we cannot feed all of those who have gathered. Philip sees a problematic predicament. A great crowd that Jesus wishes to feed. And Philip notes the disciples' lack of ministry resources to meet the need. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but what Philip sees as a problem, Jesus sees as an opportunity. Now this allows us to progress to our next point of emphasis on today. And that is, we observe a problematic predicament, but we observe also that Jesus sometimes challenges our faith. I remind you that Philip and the other disciples are aware of this problematic predicament. Jesus is insistent and adamant that they feed the crowd that has gathered. Now, in the midst of this predicament, Jesus challenges the faith of the disciples. Verse 5, Jesus asked Philip, where shall we buy bread that the crowd may eat? Verse 7 records Philip's reply, we have a limited amount of finances, and it's clearly not enough to feed this gathered crowd. Now, tucked in between those verses, it says this in verse 6. But this Jesus said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Now listen, Jesus poses the question to Philip about feeding the crowd, and yet Jesus was well aware of how he would proceed to provide food for those who had gathered. Now Philip and very likely the other disciples were panicking because of this problematic predicament. And Jesus was as cool as the other side of the pillow. Because Jesus knew what he was going to do. And you would think that these disciples would have had enough faith to understand that if Jesus posed the question, he had the power to provide. Listen, they should have known that Jesus was concerned about feeding the crowd. He could full well bring it to fruition. Yeah. Now, I have to interject here that I would have understood that if Jesus had just asked someone in the crowd, where can we purchase food so the crowd can be fed, it would have been understandable if the person in the crowd panicked like Philip did. But the difference is, Philip had been with Jesus. Listen, he had witnessed Jesus heal bodies and open blinded eyes. He had witnessed Jesus make lame people walk. He had witnessed Jesus calm raging seas and turn water into wine. And so Philip, of all the people, should not have panicked and looked at what little he had in his pocketbook. Instead of looking at his pocketbook, he could have looked to Jesus. You see, Jesus was challenging their faith. He wanted to see if they had enough faith to know that even though they were facing a problematic predicament, they could depend on Jesus to solve it. You see, Jesus already knew what he was going to do. But he wanted to test Philip's faith and the faith of the other disciples to see how they were going to react to their problematic predicament. You see, family of God, sometimes the Lord challenges our faith. He challenges our faith. He tests us just like he did Philip. He challenges our faith to see if we're going to look at what we have or whether we're going to look to him. Challenges our faith to see if we'll depend on what we have or depend on him. He challenges our faith to see if we will panic or whether we will pray. Because the Lord already knows what he's going to do. He knows what the end is going to be, and yet he challenges our faith on the way to the outcome. See, there are times the Lord is already working it out. But he wants to observe our faith for the lack thereof. Yes, problems are real. Predicaments are real. But your faith, really, all you have to do is look in your kitchen cabinet. Because your faith is like a bag of tea. When you look at it in the cabinet or in the box, it's simple, nondescript, unremarkable, and unexceptional. And yet, you can't really see what's on the inside of a bag of tea until you put it in hot water. That's how we are, family, y'all. The Lord sometimes allows us to be put in the hot water of life's predicaments to see how much faith that's on the inside of us. He wants to know if we will focus on the enormity of our problem or the sovereignty of our Savior. He wants to know if we'll focus on our problem or on the power of God. He wants to know if we'll focus on the size of our problem or focus on the fact that Jesus is the problem solver. Sometimes the Lord will put us in situations that he knows where he's taking us, and he knows how it's going to turn out because he knows the end before the beginning, but he wants us to trust him and to have confidence in his power. He wants us to know that if the Lord brings us to it, he's more than able to bring us through. So I'm almost done, y'all. Y'all got Mother's Day lunch and dinner to go to. So I'm going to let you go on. We observe a problematic predicament. We observe that Jesus sometimes challenges our faith. All right, man. But this ought to shout us on today. We observe, lastly, that Jesus is able to work with partial provision. Lord is able to work with partial provision. Now, we've referred to Philip's response to Jesus when Jesus asked him, where shall we buy bread so that these may eat? Philip Philip's response is a panicked response. The money that we have is not sufficient to feed this crowd. Yeah. Even if we just gave them a small portion to eat. As Philip is panicking, one of the other disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, is out canvassing the crowd. Yes, sir. In the Gospel of Mark's record of this miracle, Jesus had commanded the disciples to see how many loaves they had. All right. John goes into further detail about this discovery of the small initial partial provision they returned with. Yes, sir. Look at verses 8 and 9. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?" Andrew had discovered an unselfish young man who was willing to donate to the cause. And yet there's still a level of skepticism, cynicism, and pessimism displayed by Andrew. This is what he says. "We have found a young man who is willing to surrender his little lunch of 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what is this among so many people who have gathered?" Now, we've observed Philip's lack of faith earlier. Now, Andrew chimes in. Andrew questions the method of Jesus. Can you imagine Andrew thinking, Jesus could have sent this crowd away to obtain their own food a long time ago. Now he's allowed their hunger to become severe and serious. And now all we have to work with is a little lad's lunch. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. If Andrew was like many of us, he was probably thinking, if this thing goes wrong and the crowd gets angry, I'm going to put Jesus to the front and let him handle crowd control. Again, we hear Jesus saying, Andrew saying to Jesus, all we have is a little lad's lunch. 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. Now, I'm sure the disciples were expecting a far different response from Jesus than the one they received. Yes, sir. I'm sure they were prepared to hear Jesus say to them, listen, you went out into this big old crowd and found only this small amount of food. Between the 12 of you, don't you think you could have done a little bit better? And yet, when Andrew tells Jesus, we only have 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, Jesus seems to, in essence, say, that's all I need. It may be partial provision, but I can handle the rest. This little lad's lunch may have been meant to feed and nourish one little boy's body, but in my hands, Jesus says it will become a bona fide banquet for thousands of people. You see, partial provision in our hands is pitiful, pathetic, and puny. But in the hands of Jesus, partial provision is abundance and ample and bountiful and overflowing. Partial provision in our hands is never enough. But partial provision in the hands of Jesus is more than enough. Listen to what the text says in verses 10 and 11. Then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place. So the men sat down in number about 5,000. Jesus took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed to them the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of fish as much as they wanted. The Bible tells us Jesus works with partial provision. But then he provides completely to the crowd. What was meant for one little lamb in the hands of Jesus was able to satiate, satisfy, and take away the hunger of thousands. See, Philip was worried about how little bread they could purchase with this little money they had. But Jesus knew if you just put a small amount in my hands, little becomes much when you put it in the master's hands. You see, verse 11 says, Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. It says that Jesus gave thanks before he started handing out this partial provision. It is suggested that Jesus, in giving thanks, said grace by using a customary table prayer. And normally, you don't say grace if you're not confident that there's enough to feed everybody at the table. So in other words, Jesus was saying, thank you, Lord, for this food we're about to receive. Somebody would have said, Jesus, you just have a few loaves and a couple of fish. And Jesus would say, thank you, Lord, for this food we're about to receive. But Jesus, don't you see this great gathered crowd and a lunch prepared for one? And Jesus would say, thank you, Lord, for this food we're about to receive. Jesus was saying to all who were watching, you may not see it, you may not believe it, and you may not understand it, but I am giving thanks in advance for what we are about to receive. We need to understand that he can start with partial provision and move partial provision to enough, and then he can move enough to abundance. Y'all don't believe this right there in this text. Listen again with me at verses 11 through 13. Jesus took the loaves. When he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish as much as they wanted. Now check this out. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. I told you he can move from partial provision to enough to leftovers. Y'all missed that. It went from not enough to partial provision to enough and then to leftovers. Sometimes we have to be like Jesus and admit that it's partial right now. But we ought to go ahead and declare, thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to receive. Yeah, I know it's a partial breakthrough right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to receive. I know it's partial healing right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to receive. I know it's a partial promotion right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I am about to receive. Listen, I know I have partial peace right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to receive. I know it's partial deliverance right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I'm about to receive. Thank you, because it's partial restoration right now. But thank you, Lord, for what I am about to receive. And listen, somebody in the sanctuary of the Mount Zion Church ought to tell the Lord, Lord, I have enough faith to understand that it's partial provision right now. But when I put it in your hands, I can already go ahead and declare, thank you, Lord, for what I am about to receive. Do I have a witness this afternoon? that we can tell the Lord, thank you in advance? Do I have a witness today? Somebody here in the sanctuary ought to tell the Lord, thank you in advance for what I am about to receive. Do I have a witness today? Because when I put it in the hands of the Lord, I know that everything is going to be all right. Do I have a witness today? Well, you ought to tell him thank you in advance. Do I have a witness? Because when you put it in the Lord's hands, everything is going to be all right. Do I have a witness today? I got to leave you here. Let you go on home. Yes, Lord. But when I was growing up as a young boy here in the Mount Zion Church, I used to hear Daddy sing the song and declare that the Lord will make a way somehow. And he'd say in his sermon that the Lord will make a way out of no way. Well, as I was growing up, Brother Doug, I didn't understand. It didn't make much sense. There was no logic in the fact that the Lord would make a way out of no way. Do I have a witness here? I just couldn't comprehend that if it was no way that the Lord would make a way. Well, as I lived a little longer, I got in some no-way situations, and the Lord made a way out of no way. That's why today, right here in John chapter 6, I believe that the Lord will make a way out of no way. I need to know, is there anybody here who understands today? If you put it in Jesus' hands, He will make a way out of no way. Won't He do it? Won't He make a way out of no way? Is there anybody here who's put it in the hands of Jesus and He made a way out of no way? Won't He do it? I said, won't He do it? Say yes. Say yes. He will.